The headlights cut through the fog, like twin daggers, reflecting off the black surface of the lake. A car door slams. Boots crunch on gravel. Moments later, a loud splash rips through the night. Hours later, police would find the car, doors locked, engine running. And inside, a story so sloppy, so bizarre, it would stun even veteran detectives. It was April 18, 2005, in the quiet lakeside town of Laconia, New Hampshire. 34-year-old Sarah Whitman, a beloved elementary school teacher, had been reported missing. Her husband, Mark Whitman, claimed she tragically drowned after driving off a pier in a freak accident. But within days that story unraveled, revealing something far darker and much clumsier than anyone could have imagined. Sarah was unforgettable. Warm, kind, and endlessly creative. She taught second grade at Elm Grove Elementary, where fairy lights and hand-painted murals turned her classroom into a world of magic. She loved early morning jogs by the lake, caramel lattes, and curling up with old Agatha Christie novels, an ironic favorite. She dreamed of starting a family, and maybe one day opening her own little art studio. Her husband, Mark Whitman, was her opposite. Quiet, rigid, a mechanical engineer who thrived on structure. Pressed shirts even on weekends. A black sedan polished to perfection. He had a habit of tapping his pen against his teeth when deep in thought. To neighbors they looked picture perfect. But Sarah's closest friend once said, "You never really saw them laugh together." In the weeks before she vanished, Sarah confided in friends that she felt trapped. Mark had become distant, critical, controlling. She stayed late at school just to avoid him. 2 nights before her disappearance, Sarah called her sister and whispered something chilling, "I feel like I'm being watched. Even in my own house." That same night, a neighbor spotted Mark loading something heavy into his car's trunk, a large duffel bag. He brushed it off as just some old tools. The night of April 18th was bitterly cold for spring. At 10:37 p.m., a fisherman on Lake Winnisquam reported hearing a splash, followed by the sound of an engine sputtering out. Police arrived minutes later to find Sarah's silver Honda Civic, nose down in the water. The headlights glowed eerily beneath the lake's surface. The driver's side window was rolled halfway down. Divers pulled the car out, and what they found inside sent a chill through the air: an empty driver's seat. Sarah's purse, dry, resting neatly on the passenger side. Her shoes, placed side by side on the floor mat. Mark was already there, pacing, wringing his hands. He told officers Sarah had been depressed and must have snapped. But the scene felt staged. The purse was dry despite the car being submerged. There were no skid marks, no sign of acceleration before the car rolled off the pier. Police immediately flagged Sarah's disappearance as suspicious. The driver's seat was pushed too far back for Sarah, who barely reached 5 feet tall, to have even touched the pedals. The ignition showed signs of tampering. Sarah's phone had been completely wiped of recent texts. Witnesses recalled seeing Mark earlier that evening at a gas station near the lake, buying duct tape, bleach, and a tarp. His excuse? Spring cleaning. At first, police entertained a grim possibility. Had Sarah staged her own disappearance? Maybe she'd run away. But that theory crumbled days later when divers found a bloodied rope tangled around the pier supports. The blood matched Sarah's DNA. Could it have been a random kidnapping? Detectives canvassed the town. No suspicious strangers. No unusual activity. But surveillance footage told a different story. Mark's black sedan circling the lake, over and over again that night. Then came the breakthrough. A neighbor handed over security footage from April 17th, the night before Sarah vanished. On it, Mark struggled to drag what looked like a large limp object, wrapped in a tarp, from the garage to his trunk. He said it was an old carpet. Forensic teams later found matching tarp fibers in Sarah's car. The pieces were falling into place. Investigators believed Mark killed Sarah at home, staged the car scene, and dumped her body. But even with mounting evidence, one haunting detail remained: Sarah's body was still missing. On May 2, 2005, police arrested Mark Whitman for suspicion of murder. He refused to talk. Without a body, prosecutors knew the trial would be a battle. Meanwhile, divers expanded their search far beyond Lake Winnisquam, terrified that Mark had moved her remains after the botched scene. What no one knew then was that Mark had made a catastrophic mistake. One piece of evidence, so chilling, so damning, had been left behind. And when investigators found it, his entire story would come crashing down. In a quiet New Hampshire town where people rarely locked their doors, a husband's elaborate plan to fake his wife's death was unraveling like wet rope. But police were only scratching the surface. The next discovery would expose just how far Mark went to cover his tracks, and why he failed so spectacularly. So, what do you think happened to Sarah Whitman? Did Mark act alone? Or was someone else pulling the strings? The search for Sarah Whitman stretched into its second week. Divers scoured Lake Winnisquam, combing through reeds and silt. Helicopters hovered above wooded trails while cadaver dogs sniffed for the faintest trace of her scent. But every search came up empty. It was as if Sarah had vanished into thin air. Meanwhile, Mark Whitman sat in an interrogation room, stone-faced. Detectives pressed him hour after hour, but he gave nothing, just shrugged shoulders, cold stares, and the same rehearsed line, "I don't know where she is." Without a body, prosecutors were cautious. They had circumstantial evidence, strong but not bulletproof. They needed something undeniable. Then came the break. Two detectives revisited the Whitman home, determined to recheck every inch. Sarah's friends had mentioned she loved to paint in the garage. So, they brought luminol, the chemical that reveals traces of blood invisible to the naked eye. When the garage lights flickered off and the luminol spray hit the concrete floor, the truth came alive. The entire garage glowed in a constellation of blue splatters. There, beneath the spot where Mark's car had been parked, was a large, dark pool, blood. Sarah's blood. The scene was so grim that seasoned officers fell silent. Mark had tried to scrub the floor clean with bleach, but it wasn't enough. The garage told a story. Drag marks in the residue lined up perfectly with the security footage of Mark hauling something heavy out of the house. It was clear. Sarah had been killed in her own home, her body wrapped in a tarp and then loaded into that car trunk. But where had he taken her? Investigators retraced every movement Mark made in the days after Sarah disappeared. Surveillance footage placed him driving not just around the lake but along back roads leading deep into a nearby forest preserve. A search team was deployed, combing through acres of pine and maple trees. 3 miles in, a deputy noticed a patch of disturbed earth near an old logging trail. The ground was uneven, the dirt recently packed down. They started to dig. Within minutes, the shovel hit something. A tarp. Wrapped tightly inside was the body of Sarah Whitman. She was dressed in the same jogging clothes she'd been wearing that evening. Rope burns were visible on her wrists and ankles. An autopsy later revealed she died from blunt force trauma to the head. She never made it to the lake. Mark had killed her at home, staged the car scene, and buried her in the woods, likely planning to move her again when suspicion died down. News of Sarah's discovery rocked the quiet town. Candlelight vigils lined Main Street. Parents at Elm Grove Elementary wept openly, mourning the teacher who'd treated every child like her own. Meanwhile, Mark Whitman's facade began to crack. In jail, he made a mistake, one that prosecutors would use to seal his fate. He called a friend from the holding cell, unaware that every word was being recorded. On that call, Mark didn't ask about his wife. He didn't grieve. Instead, he whispered, "Do they know about the hammer?" That single sentence confirmed what investigators already suspected. Sarah had been bludgeoned. Prosecutors went all in. Mark was charged with first-degree murder, evidence tampering, and obstruction of justice. The trial began in March of 2006, and it was a media sensation. Cameras flashed as Mark was led into court wearing an ill-fitting suit, eyes hollow. The prosecution painted him as a cold, calculated killer who had meticulously planned his wife's death, but was undone by arrogance and carelessness. They laid out every piece of evidence: the bloody rope from the pier, the luminol-soaked garage floor, the tarp fibers in Sarah's car, the suspicious gas station purchases, and finally the chilling phone call about the hammer. Witness after witness testified that Sarah had been terrified in the weeks before she died. One coworker even recalled Sarah quietly saying, "If anything happens to me, look at Mark." Mark's defense team scrambled. They argued Sarah's death was accidental, a domestic argument gone wrong. They claimed Mark panicked and staged the scene out of fear. But his calm, calculated actions in the days that followed, cleaning the garage, dumping the body, wiping her phone, spoke volumes. The jury deliberated for just 8 hours. On April 12, 2006, Mark Whitman was found guilty of first-degree murder and sentenced to life in prison without parole. Sarah's family wept as the verdict was read. Justice had been served, but the details of the case left the town haunted. Because while the jury had their answer, one question lingered: why? Investigators uncovered that Mark had been spiraling financially. He'd taken out multiple secret credit cards and had been gambling heavily. Sarah had recently discovered the mounting debt and threatened to leave him. Prosecutors believed that fear of losing her, and perhaps losing control over their image as the perfect couple, was his motive. But there were chilling details Mark never explained. Like why he'd circled the lake so many times that night. Or who he'd texted right before the murder. Those messages were permanently deleted. And why, in the weeks after his arrest, he'd reportedly whispered to his cellmate that Sarah wasn't supposed to die like that. Some detectives believe there's more to this story. That Mark may have had help moving Sarah's body. That someone else might have known what he was planning. But with Mark refusing to speak to this day, those secrets may have been buried along with Sarah. The Whitman home was eventually sold, but locals say no one stays there long. Neighbors swear they've heard banging sounds from the garage at night. One delivery driver said he saw a woman's silhouette standing in the upstairs window, even though the house was empty. In the end, Mark's attempt to fake his wife's death was so sloppy that investigators pieced together the truth in just weeks. But the echoes of that night, the splash in the lake, the glowing blood under luminol, the shallow grave in the forest, still haunt Laconia. Sarah Whitman will be remembered as a kind teacher, a loving sister, and a woman who deserved so much more than the cold betrayal she suffered. And as for Mark, he's serving life without parole at New Hampshire State Prison, where he remains silent, never speaking of Sarah. But some believe there's still more to this story. Could Mark's clumsy plan have been part of something bigger? Did someone help him cover his tracks? Or was this simply the desperate act of a man who thought he was smarter than everyone else? Let us know your theories in the comments. And remember, even the most perfect families can hide terrifying secrets.